Okay. Thank you very much. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our first keynote presenter for the Small-Scale Multilingualism Conference #2, Dr. Ruth Singer from the University of Melbourne. No doubt we'll catch glimpses of Ruth's achievements throughout this presentation, but I'd like to take the opportunity to just maybe embarrass Ruth a little bit by sharing with you some of her many achievements. Ruth was awarded her PhD by completing a dissertation on the semantics of grammatical gender in Hmong, and has continued to work closely with speakers of Hmong and their community in developing co-researched projects to enhance understanding of Hmong in a holistic way. Not only has Ruth worked on grammatical aspects of Hmong, she has been developing digital resources with young people of Warruwi community, along with other collaborators. On the academic side, Ruth has held positions at the Max Planck Institute of Psycholinguistics, at Rabobank University, the Australian National University, and La Trobe University. So please warmly welcome Ruth and her talk entitled Small-Scale Multilingualism, The View from Warruwi.
Thanks very much, Eri, for the lovely introduction. I'd also like to thank the conference organisers for inviting me to speak and just for organising the conference. I'm very excited about being able to participate in this one, having missed the Small-Scale Multilingualism Conference 1 in Lyon. So I'd like to thank the Finnish Linguistics Association, the Sign Language Centre at Jyväskylä University, and also the University of Helsinki. Thanks very much. I also would like to thank Pier Paolo Di Carlo in advance for his commentary and questions, which will follow the talk. My name's Ruth Singer, and I'm based at Melbourne University in Australia. I'm going to have a look at how people do small-scale multilingualism at Warruwi, which is a community I've worked with on small-scale multilingualism. I'm going to talk about the steps that took me to researching multilingualism, and then spend a bit of time talking about one topic I've looked at a lot, which is receptive multilingualism, or the ability to understand a language without speaking it. And to conclude, I just want to reflect on this very new field, where we've come so far and where we might be going. So I'll start with a traditional Australian acknowledgement of country. I'm speaking to you today from Naarm, or Melbourne, Australia, on the land of Wurundjeri people whose land is Warruwi. In this photo, you can see Wurundjeri elders addressing our state parliament in the Warruwi language. I'd also like to acknowledge Helsinki as a place which is home to many different languages and cultures, and flourishing multilingualism. The other thing I'd like to put up first and foremost is that all this research comes out of a collaboration with Warruwi community, and without Warruwi community and the people there who've worked with me and supported the research, none of this would have been possible. So Warruwi is foundational to all the research presented here, and it's quite unusual in the Australian context in that many Indigenous languages are still spoken there. In fact, in the most recent national survey, only 12 Indigenous Australian languages were considered strong, which means that they're being passed on to the next generation without any special interventions. So originally there were many hundreds of languages spoken, and each of them had between a few hundred or a few thousand speakers. So they were all very small, which makes an environment which is ripe for small-scale multilingualism. And we think that the kind of small-scale multilingualism that still continues at Warruwi was probably found in many parts of the country in some form or another. So these photos are just some of the people that I work with, and some of them you'll see later in the talk. So just a couple of starting points, I guess, for the talk. firstly, why would we research small-scale multilingualism? I guess everyone who's come into the field has got different reasons why they want to research small-scale multilingualism. And I'll talk later about how I came to it, just, you know, as part of my life in general and my research. But basically the main questions which interest me are finding out more about how small languages persist, understanding multilingualism in all its forms. Most multilingualism research focuses on minoritized migrant communities in countries which have a fairly monolingual mindset, rather than looking at communities which have a lot of languages. I'm also interested in reconstructing language change and modeling the evolution of linguistic diversity. And I just put here some recent inspirations, some recent work in the area of small-scale multilingualism. The special issue of the International Journal of Bilingualism was mentioned in the introduction. So there's a lot of great papers there coming out of the previous conference. And also recent is the African Multilingualisms book, edited by Pier Paolo Di Carlo and Jeff Good, and showing a real, the strength of their research and the collaboration that's taken place between different nations, different communities, and all the different projects that it's supported. And of course, in case you missed it, the ILARA YouTube panels on small-scale multilingualism, which Friederike organized, and I helped a bit with one of them. So if you haven't caught them on YouTube, they're definitely worth a look. So where and what is Warruwi? Warruwi is the name of South Goulburn Island, the Maung name for it, which is a relatively small island you can see here. It's about an hour's flight in a small plane from Darwin, which is a regional capital. And this, as you can see from this map of Australia, is right at the top of Australia on the coast there. So although it may seem like a pretty isolated spot, and it's true that the population density is pretty low out here, it might look at first glance like wilderness. People have a fairly high level of mobility, and they move around a lot between different Indigenous communities, such as Maningrida to the east, which Jill Vaughan will be discussing her talk about Maningrida in the next session. And Onpeli and Minjalang, other Indigenous communities, and Darwin, the regional capital, which John Mansfield will be talking about on Wednesday. So, in fact, people have fairly rich social networks that cover all these places and beyond, right down to Central Australia and even Melbourne. So to have a bit more of a look at Arnhem Land itself, which is where Warruwi is found, Darwin, which we saw on the other map, is just off the edge of this map. And Warruwi is here where it says Manangari. So Manangari is a name for a language which is said to have been spoken on Warruwi in the past, although we don't have much record of it or memories of it. So Arnhem Land is unusual because it's quite a large area of land, 100,000 square kilometres, which is all owned by Indigenous people under Australian law. So according to different clans which people are members of, they own a small clan estate. And so these boundaries here of languages and the clan estates are within them, so they're smaller. So each one will contain a number of different clan estates, which are clans which are associated with that land, and that land is associated with the language marked on the map. So it doesn't indicate particularly where people live, certainly not today. So not shown on the map here is sign language or sign languages of this area. These are quite underdocumented. So far, most of the work on sign language, Indigenous sign language, has been in Central Australia. And so work in the Arnhem Land is just getting started. And so we don't have a clear idea of whether there's one language across Arnhem Land or separate ones. So the other reason it isn't shown on the map is it's not closely associated with land and land ownership. and these kind of land-based, I guess, identities. The sign language which is spoken is used by the whole community, hearing or not, with or without speech. It's known as an alternate or auxiliary sign language. And it seems likely that it is used to support multilingual communication. So particularly where there isn't much language that people have in common, spoken language, then it seems that a lot of these signs are very similar or the same across Arnhem Land. So I'm currently working with Indigenous sign language expert Jenny Green to document sign at Warruwi. And she's also been working at Maningrida, and other people are working in East Arnhem. So the next map shows the language family, so you can get a sense of the kind of linguistic diversity in Arnhem Land. So each of these circles shows a different language family. So Maung is part of the Iwajan language family with the blue circle. Then the purple circle is the Gunwinguan language family. And then the small green circle is the Maningreen language family. And the yellow circle is the Pamanyungan language family, which is a family that also, as well as having this small isolated patch, also covers most of Australia. So this area of Australia is actually much higher in linguistic diversity than the rest of it because there's lots of different families found. So I'd just like to trace back a bit how I got interested in multilingualism at Warruwi and some of the first kind of things I was interested in when I started to think about multilingualism. So yeah, like a lot of people working in the field of small-scale multilingualism, I started by working on a single language. So when I first came up to Warruwi, my focus was the Maung language, which is a small language with a few hundred speakers. And I worked closely with Nita Garijalalug in the blue t-shirt here. So we were doing language documentation, structural analysis, so syntax, semantics, and also linguistic typology. And my focus was nominal classification. And also we were doing community-oriented work. So working on the Maung dictionary, which has just been published in print form. And also this website, which has recordings that I've made and that previous linguists have made so people can access them, and also an online dictionary. So when I started doing research on multilingualism, my big interest was trying to put together a picture of how Maung had continued to be used for so long. Maung is still being learned by all generations. If people leave the community, sometimes children don't keep learning Maung, depending on what the family language policy is. But basically in the community, people who have a parent who identifies as Maung speaker, those kids will also learn, grow up speaking Maung. So with a few hundred speakers, it's one of the smallest Indigenous Australian languages still considered strong. And it's thought that it probably always had only a few hundred speakers. At least that seemed, based on the evidence we have, it probably was always quite small. The other thing I noticed from talking to other linguists who worked with Indigenous Australian communities is that Warruwi seemed to have a lot of different Indigenous languages spoken. So in other communities, it seemed that the community had shifted on a single communalect. So they may speak different languages, but there was one that most people used, which was sort of seen as the language of the place. And this had sort of supplanted all the other languages, ancestral languages that people had had. So I was interested in what had happened at Warruwi and why it was different. So in 2011, I started researching multilingualism, interviewing adults and children, and recording multilingual conversations. And in this picture here, you can see me interviewing Janet Mardbinder when she was 15 and still studying at Warruwi School. So Janet ended up becoming an important part of the project as a staff member and doing a lot of interviewing herself. So we'll hear about her a bit more later on. Just as a bit of an introduction, I thought you might like to hear this video, which I made with Nancy Ngalminjalmak. The idea is that we'll use it in an online Maung course where you could sort of meet some of the speakers. So I'll just play it now. Let me know if you have any problems hearing it.
Abi nga lang ilan. Anda nga like Nancy. Auran Warruwi. Kani bamra ini. Anda nga ral kang in kamao. Lokapo ni nga nyuji. My name is Nancy. I was born and bred here at Warruwi. And the language that I have learned from my dad is Maung, that he taught me.
So I guess my initial findings fell into two groups. With the interviews, I was doing linguistic biographies. So I was asking people about their lives and the languages they used throughout the course of their life with different people who they lived with or their family. And also doing the language portrait task, which was popularized by the Austrian linguist Brigitte Busch. So you might recognize it from other work. You provide people with an outline of the body and some color pencils, and then ask them to color it in according to their languages. So this is Nancy's, who you just heard from before, and as she identified herself as a Maung speaker in the video, but this is not the only language she speaks. And in fact, she identifies Gunbalang as one of her languages as well. Gunbalang is actually her father's language, and according to the language ownership ideology, which is quite widespread around Northern Australia, you own the language which you inherit through your father and his father, just like you inherit your clan membership and your land ownership through that patrilineal line. But Maung has become emblematic of Warruwi community. So people like Nancy, whose family has lived there for a few generations, also claim Maung, even though they might have to trace it through different ancestors rather than the one that the language ownership ideology traditionally dictated, which was through the father's father. So the other group of findings was from looking at multilingual conversations and recording them. It became clear that the domain separation model of multilingualism was not useful because people were not using different languages in different contexts in terms of places where they were. Also, there was little code switching between Indigenous languages in recordings, which was interesting, although there was code switching between English and Indigenous languages. The other thing that was clear is that linguistic accommodation was not always evident. So sometimes one person would use one language and the other person would use a different language, and they didn't seem to think there was something awkward or uncomfortable about this and a need to shift to the same language, even if they did have a common language. So some of my initial questions, possibly the same ones as I'm still grappling with, many of them, and what some of you might also be thinking about. What determines choice of language in context? Why do people often avoid accommodation and code switching? How fixed or flexible are language identities? And what is the relationship between language ideologies and language practices? Something which is always a difficult question to answer, I think. So I started reading and eventually came across work which seemed to be relevant to what I was looking at. It took quite a long time because a lot of the multilingualism research I read didn't really resonate with me in terms of what was happening at Warruwi and what I was trying to understand. But I was lucky to come across some of Friederike Lübke's work, and she had proofs of her book then, Repertoires and Choices in African Languages, ready, which she emailed me. And particularly chapter 1, Multilingualism on the Ground, sort of validated what I was trying to do at Warruwi in terms of what I was grappling with and trying to, I guess, delineate the research question and, you know, the subject of what I was looking at amongst all the things that were going on. It also helped a lot in understanding the fluidity of people's language identities and the fact that people will say quite definite things, such as Nancy's happy to say, I'm a Maung speaker, in this video, but it doesn't mean that there's not a lot of other things which you would be happy to say too. I also came across Jeff Good and Pierpaolo Di Carlo's work on Cameroon quite early, not this book, of course, which came out recently. And of course, Gall and Irvine's work on language ideologies was really useful. So the other thing that really helped was reading Australian linguistic anthropology. There was a real flourishing of work on multilingualism in the 70s and 80s. And since then, there has been more of a trickle up till now. I really hadn't read much anthropology and only a little linguistic anthropology. And this turned out to be really useful also for finding a starting point for the analysis and sort of frame the ethnographic approach and justify it. So, of course, Nick Evans's work on multilingualism in Western Arnhem Land, where Warruwi is located. He's long been concerned with multilingual language ideologies and how they influence language structure. And Murray Gard has also contributed to this a lot, working with people on the mainland across from Warruwi on dialects of Bin and Gunwok. And Francesca Merle and Alan Rumsey's linguistic anthropology of Northern Australia, they've worked across a lot of different places. And Peter Sutton's early work on Cape York, which is quite different to Warruwi because we have some very similar varieties which are identified as different languages and are important in the kind of oppositions there, but still very similar ideologically. This slide for the next section on receptive multilingualism is a still from Nowhere Girls 2. One of the things I've been lucky to be participating at Warruwi is making films with young people, which I work with some filmmakers, Elizabeth Langslow and Leandro Palacio. And basically they come up with the plot with the girls, with the young people. And the main thing is that they use their own languages in the film. That's the main, I guess, framing of the films. But apart from that, anything can happen. And Nowhere Girls 2 has been finished, and we've done all the subtitles. That's available on the website I mentioned. And we're working on number 3 now. So receptive multilingualism is something I've looked at a lot because it seemed very striking when I first came across it at Warruwi. In some ways it's everyday, and we find multilingual families in any part of the world who will speak to one another in this way, but something about the prevalence of it at Warruwi and the way people do it seemed to be significant. So receptive multilingual conversations is where one person speaks one language and the other responds in a different language. So it's an alternative to linguistic accommodation. It's a common mode of conversation at Warruwi, and it's the norm for husband and wife, Richard and Nancy, who are pictured here. It seems to allow small languages such as Maung to be used more often. So the other languages which are spoken at Warruwi generally have many more speakers, like 1,000 or a few thousand. So although Warruwi is considered, Maung is considered the language of the place, it could have been easy at any point for it to be lost in any case, even could have lost out to these larger languages. So it seems that this practice maybe is one of the ways that they've been able to resist being swamped by these other languages when the island was settled. So I didn't mention, but the island was settled about 100 years ago, and a Methodist mission was set up there. And in the 70s, it transitioned to Indigenous/government control. And the balance between Indigenous control and government control has varied since then. And so since then, it's been known as Warruwi community rather than as a mission. So I first got to know Richard and Nancy, not from doing research actually, but from going hunting with them. And one time we were looking for turtle eggs on the beach, and we went out for a few hours, and I noticed that pretty much the whole time Richard was speaking his variety of Yulngamata and Nancy was speaking Maung. And I was impressed how they sort of kept this up. It was a very fluent conversation. And there was only really one point where I noticed that Nancy switched into Yulngamata, which she also speaks fluently. And that was only for a few minutes, and then she switched back to Maung. So she can speak Yulngamata fluently, and she speaks it with his family when they come to visit. But Richard doesn't speak Maung that much. He throws a few words and phrases into his speech, but he'll say he doesn't really speak it. So we made a recording of them, and they seem to speak similarly in the recording to how they did when not being recorded. So this seems to be the way that they always talk to one another, and they've been married for 30 years. And when they got married, Richard moved to Warruwi from East Arnhem Land, where his language, Yulngamata, is the main language. But for whatever reason, he never learned to speak Maung. He only became extremely good at understanding it, so that normal fluent conversations are possible. So I wanted to show you a sort of alternative perspective on receptive multilingualism through contrasting two other recordings that we did with Nancy. So Janet Martbinder, who I mentioned before, he's become a very significant staff member on the project, was organising some interviews in 2015 where she asked people to talk about a cyclone that had recently passed through and their experiences then. So in this case, Nancy said she would like to be the interviewer. She took over that role, and that's the only time she did it. The other interviews were with Janet and other people, and Janet ran them. So when they do this interview, there's also strict use of the receptive multilingual mode. So Janet uses Gunwingu, the language from the mainland, and Nancy uses Maung, even though Nancy's fluent in Gunwingu as well, which is her mother's language. As we saw before, Nancy's very multilingual. She had put a lot of languages on her language portrait, but she's not considered completely unusual, although she is considered possibly to be quite good at languages. So similarly to when she spoke to Richard, Nancy uses Maung, even though she could also respond in the same language as the other person she's talking to. So then the next year in 2016, Janet recorded a relaxed conversation with Nancy. So this wasn't framed as an interview. And I should say that Nancy took the whole interview thing quite seriously. So it wasn't a relaxed conversation. She asked Janet one question, then she asked her another question. That's how the interview proceeded. So when Janet recorded the relaxed conversation with Nancy, Nancy's language use was quite different. So for this conversation, we recorded at the front of Nancy's house, whereas the other one had been next to the language centre. And Janet continued to use mostly Gunwingu, which she did most of the time at that point. But she put in a few more Maung words this time. But Nancy, on the other hand, was quite different. Rather than using Maung all the time, she used either Gunwingu or Maung for short stretches. So she'd speak Gunwingu for a couple of minutes, Maung for a couple of minutes, back and forth, the whole conversation. So this made me think that although the receptive multilingual mode might be the norm for Nancy and her husband, Richard, when she's talking to Janet, it might not be the norm. It might be an option and one which Nancy maybe feels is better for something more formal like an interview. So in the interview, Nancy actually spoke Maung to the point of where she accidentally used one Gunwingu word. She then repeated it again in Maung, so she corrected herself. So she was very much intentionally sticking to Maung. And quite possibly that's about formality, about a sense of authority, or an aesthetic in which using one language is seen as a bit more formal. And also wanting to represent herself perhaps as a Maung speaker in that context. So I thought I'd play you a bit of the second recording, the relaxed conversation, a bit where Nancy switches back and forth more. And in fact, the only bit where she has one sentence which has some Maung, a word of Maung and a word of Gunwingu in it. So in this recording, I've used coloured subtitles to indicate the languages. So I hope you can follow, but blue is Maung. And you can see here that Nancy starts by saying something in Maung, so that's blue. Pink is Gunwingu, and there's yellow for the sentence that has Maung and Gunwingu in it. And English words are not indicated at all. So I'll just play the recordings. This section is quite short.
Ayaw na Louis P. Mel, girl one ayawan.
You're in hospital, right?
What?
In my job.
Ah.
Doing last week.
What?
So I hope they didn't go past too fast, but as you can see, they're pretty relaxed. They're talking about the children who they can see playing in front of the house next door. And they notice that one of them is missing. And Nancy mentions how she had to go to hospital because she was sick. So I talk about this sort of contrast between the two recordings in a book that I'm working on, which I hope will come out late next year. And I think it shows that the receptive multilingual mode is common at Warruwi, but it's not obligatory, and that different people, different pairs with different sets of languages are going to choose different options in different contexts. So I'd like to talk a bit more about what I call receptive competence, which is the ability to hear a language and bilingual cognition, and how this might be relevant to understanding language change in context of small-scale multilingualism. So receptive competence is used to refer to the linguistic knowledge of hearers, as they're called in Indigenous languages. You generally distinguish between speaking a language and hearing, and you use the expression for hearing there to talk about that understanding a language without speaking it. So these people have comprehension abilities, but very limited production skills. So this has actually not been well researched in either psycholinguistics or applied linguistics. Receptive competence has been considered a type of incomplete language learning or a feature of language attrition, language loss. But I think you can see with people like Richard and Janet, they've lived at Warruwi a long time in the case of Richard, or they've grown up at Warruwi in the case of Janet. Their understanding of Maung is near native. It's not that they just didn't finish learning Maung, it's perhaps that they had a different target for acquisition. So exactly why that is difficult to explain for each person. But in the case of Janet, she was actively told not to speak Maung by her family. They have a strong Gunwingu identity and they didn't want her to be speaking Maung. But of course, she grew up with a lot of Maung speaking children, so she learned to understand it. So if we don't know what kind of knowledge people have when they have receptive competence, we don't have a full picture of their linguistic knowledge. And in terms of language change, languages change because of bilingual people's knowledge. So bilingual children growing up change their languages according to the kind of multilingualism that they're using. So the figure I've got here is meant to depict that somebody might be speaking to somebody in one language and they might be speaking back in another. But both those people must have knowledge of two languages in their heads. The type of knowledge they have of each could be different, but at this point, we don't actually know if it is different or how it is different. So I think we need to understand that to understand how language change is happening as a consequence of bilingual cognition in these communities. So there's been quite a bit of recent work on receptive competence. Although I said it hasn't really been researched, there hasn't been much of a focus on it in psycholinguistics or applied linguistics. There's been a little bit of work recently. So in the African Multilingualisms book, we have 2 chapters that look at receptive competence. So Esene Aguara's chapter surveys receptive and productive competence and shows how there's a certain number of languages that each person speaks in the Lower Fungam area. And then there's always more languages that they understand on top of that. So that's part of people's repertoire. And Mba and Santem use tests to show that this self-report of receptive and productive competence is relatively accurate. So they use various tests, comprehension and productive tests, to measure people's language abilities and then compare this with their self-report. So another study which is related but not in a small-scale multilingual context is Shakina Lieber's work between 2011 and 2015. So she worked with an Indigenous community in Canada who was shifting to English. So many of the generation she worked with didn't speak Labrador and Ngunnawal, but could understand it to varying degrees. So she used various kinds of tests, which are often used in applied linguistics, to show that some receptive multilinguals had near native comprehension skills. So rather than being some incomplete type of acquisition, in fact, their skills were up there with native speakers. So I wanted to present some pilot results from some research on receptive competence that I'm doing. Basically, I was inspired by Shakina Lieber's work. I hadn't come across the work in African multilingualisms yet, to run a set of 4 experiments. And so far I've only run one, and only not quite with enough speakers yet, but basically it's a grammaticality judgment task. So I put together 120 simple sentences, such as Nangalu went to the beach, through workshopping them with people, with Maung speakers, and half the sentences had a small error, a fairly subtle grammatical error. So either in the verb morphology or in the noun phrase agreement. So it might have been in gender agreement, it might have been in the tense marking on the verb, that there were certain morphemes that can't usually co-occur. So I ran it on the Open Sesame app. So people will sit at the laptop with headphones and they hear all these sentences, and after each sentence they have to press that's grammatical or it's not grammatical. So what you see here is 10 participants, and the red bar is the proportion of grammatical sentences which they correctly judge to be grammatical. And the blue ones are the proportion of the non-grammatical ones which they correctly judge to be non-grammatical. So in the green, you can see the 3 hearers, people with receptive competence. So you can see that these are not too different actually to the people who identify speakers of Maung, and only marginally significant using Pearson's correlation. So I'm hoping to expand the number of participants. It's quite hard to get hearers involved because they're like, I don't speak Maung, so you probably don't need me for your research, because people know that I work a lot with Maung speakers. So I have to convince people to participate, and I'm hoping to convince more people and also run other kinds of experiment on comprehension and production to get a better handle on exactly what kind of knowledge people have who hear a language. So that's one of the new directions in my work with Warruwi at the moment. The other one, which I mentioned earlier, was the sign work with Jenny Green. So we're doing some sign, very sort of initial basic sign lexicography, and hoping to expand the online sign dictionary Ilchum Ilchum, which is being relaunched, hopefully by International Sign Language Day on the 23rd of September. It previously had these Central Australian languages down the bottom of the map, and it'll have Gurindji here and up the top some Maung examples. So here you can see, actually not just Maung, but also Gunbalang. This video on the left I'm going to show you is Sandra Makulngu speaking Maung and giving the sign for I'm angry. And then Rachel Mainborough is demonstrating one of these classic kinship signs, which you find all around Australia, where people touch parts of the body to demonstrate different family members. And I'm also starting to work on language contact and change, partly in collaboration with the Gram Adapt project, who ran a a panel in the Australian Linguistic Society conference last year, and you can see that with this YouTube link. So I'd like to conclude just by reflecting a bit on where the field's going and where it's been. So I feel like with my work, it's going in a certain direction with these green blocks here. And I feel like actually a lot of the field is sort of moving along a bit. So myself, I feel like where I started was language ideologies. So I asked people their perspectives on language, and I wrote them down, what they thought about language, what they thought people should do with language, how they identified with languages, and then moved on to language practices and tried to look at how they matched or didn't match with language ideologies, that kind of thing. Now I'm getting interested in bilingual cognition. That might still be a bit of a niche area, but I think a lot of people in the field are starting to get interested in language contact and language change. I know some people in the field, like Paddy Epps, have long been interested in these questions, and that's been a part of their interest in small-scale multilingualism. And I think different people are getting involved in looking at this who work in areas where Indigenous languages aren't spoken anymore. But even with the historical records, you can try and piece together how people used languages. And Felicity Meekins is going to discuss her talk in the next session, looking at Jingaloo and Mutbara, two languages which seem to have had a very close relationship and share a large number of their words while still remaining distinct languages. And she reconstructs that as a result of small-scale multilingualism. So at the moment, people are also expanding connections between small-scale multilingualism and other areas of linguistics, which I think is really important. So sociolinguistics obviously is relevant. Also psycholinguistics, which I'm trying to make connections. So with the experiments, I forgot to mention, I'm working with psycholinguist Evan Kidd. He's advising me on designing the experiments. Historical linguistics, I think people are forging more connections there, and language evolution, and also expanding connections to other humanities. And I know I mentioned how reading anthropology was really important for me to understand how language and society related at Warruwi. I also work a lot with musicologists who, like linguists who work in this area, are connecting anthropology with music in their case. And so a lot of the ways that people own music and pass on music and songs at Warruwi is similar to their relationship with languages. So I've learned a lot from working with them, and also with their ways of working, which in many ways are a bit more decolonizing than methods we've developed in linguistics. And also links to history, sociology, and Indigenous studies. And one of the other things people are really developing now in the field is quantitative approaches. So I talked about work on language processing, but there's also spatial modeling, like Jeff Good is doing, and language evolution models and other things, other kind of quantitative approaches. I think quantitative approaches can be really useful, but I think in the field of small-scale multilingualism, we have to make sure that there's also a foundation of careful ethnographic research, because that's really one of our strengths. And also, I guess, as I'm finding in small communities, sometimes it can be hard to get more than a small amount of data. So you might have more descriptive statistics than a really robust amount of data to do various analyses with. So the theme of the conference is recentering multilingualism. And I really like this theme because I know in the past I've written in ways that try to define the boundary of the field and define small-scale multilingualism, so reify it. For example, in my introduction with Jill Vaughan to our language and communication special issue. But I think, you know, we're strong enough and confident enough now that we don't need to be so much about setting boundaries and defining things and saying we exist, but focus on integrating with broader research in other disciplines. I think that's really the way forward now. It's a useful category for bringing us together. But as we can see, small-scale multilingualism is also very diverse. So we can learn a lot by integrating with other work on multilingualism. I just wanted to briefly mention decolonizing small-scale multilingualism research. I think the whole of linguistics and any other discipline, we need to think about how the fields in which we work have been shaped by colonial and imperialist projects, and how our work can inadvertently continue those projects, and how we can subvert that and redirect our energies so as not to do that. I've quoted here Irvin and Gall's famous quote, "There is no view from nowhere, no gaze that's not positioned." This is often taken to be about the inherently political nature of language ideologies. But I went back and had a look at the chapter in which it appears. And actually they go on to talk about how difficult it is to reflect on the ideological positioning of current academic work. How it's much easier to reflect on earlier eras and say, oh, look at these, you know, colonists in Africa, they were doing terrible things with language and trying to impose all these terrible ideas, or look what the missionaries were doing. But actually what we're doing right now is very hard for us to think about. But I think one of the great things about small-scale multilingualism field is it's so new. So maybe we've still got time to look around and think about, well, how are we doing things and what are better ways we can do it? So I think the field really needs to, as anthropologist Paige West said in relation to anthropology, we could also think about how to foster new conversations, which both work to redress previous dispossessions and to create and strengthen new forms of reciprocal collaboration. And I think one of the strengths of our field is a lot of really great collaboration, groundbreaking collaborations that push how collaborative research can be and how much it can benefit the communities and the nations that we're working with. And another real inspiration in this direction was Native American linguistic anthropologist Jenny Davis's commentary on a panel that I organised with Jill Vaughan recently at the Sociolinguistic Symposium 23. And we've put all our talks online. This link goes to Jenny Davis's commentary, which she reflected on all the talks and talked a bit about the strengths of the field and where it could go. So I've drawn on that a little bit. But if you go to this link, you'll also find the channel with all the other talks in there. So some of the strengths that she pointed out, which I guess I sort of realized, but it helped that she pointed them out. I think we really want to foster these strengths in the field of small-scale multilingualism. So she pointed out long-term close collaborations with many communities or nations. So in the case of my work with Warruwi, it's within one nation working with a community, but in the case of the work with Cameroon, with Lower Fungum area, there's people based in the US working with Cameroonian universities, working with students, which they're supervising. And I think that's, you know, all those great chapters in their book shows how strong all that collaboration is and what kind of work you can do, which would never happen without that kind of collaboration. And the other thing she pointed out is how interdisciplinary it is. Particularly in linguistics, I think we can become very inward looking, but there's been a lot of collaborations with other researchers across the discipline of linguistics and into other disciplines. And I just put photos here of Isabel O'Keefe and Reuben Brown, who are the musicologists I work with a lot. These photos of them at Warruwi, and Liz Langslow in the middle here with her baby, who is the filmmakers that I work with. And it's really opened my eyes to a lot of things that are happening at Warruwi with multilingualism through doing this, what I thought was sort of tangential work, I guess. The other thing that's I think is really important is that it's a pretty new field, and so it's very open at the moment. I think this conference has really opened it up to lots of different researchers working on sign language, working in urban contexts. And I think as the field gets older and bigger, we need to resist that tendency to be gatekeeping and keeping people out of the field. And I think we need to continually be outward looking, collaborative, and welcoming newcomers to the field. So I'd like to end on that note, and I'm looking forward to your questions a lot, and also to the following sessions discussing all the great talks that have been uploaded.